former presidential candidate Mitt Romney coming out not just against GOP frontrunner Donald Trump, but calling the candidate a fraud. And in true Trump fashion, the candidate didn't waste any time in firing back.
Donald Trump is a phony, a fraud. His promises are as worthless as a degree from Trump University.
I backed Mitt Romney. I backed him. You can see how loyal he is. He was begging for my endorsement. I could have said, Mitt, drop to your knees. He would have dropped to his knees. He was begging.
He's playing the members of the American public for suckers. He gets a free ride to the White House, and all we get is a lousy hat.
We're going to hit on all of that today. Democratic strategist Steve Welchert joins us here, and the former chair of the Colorado Republican Party, Ryan Call. And Ryan, let's start with Donald Trump, because we just saw that back and forth. He seems to be popular right now with the majority of the states and the voters in those states, but not the GOP leadership. So what's the underlying message Republican voters are trying to send to the leadership?
I think that voters are frustrated and angry about both what they've seen under the Obama administration as well as what they perceive as a lack of backbone on the part of Republican elected officials and other party leaders. It's important to remember Donald Trump is not receiving a majority of the votes. In most of these states, he's getting about a third, maybe approaching 40% of the electorate, but a majority of voters are choosing someone other than Donald Trump in their states. But because of the way the delegate allocation regime works, he is winning more of those delegate votes.
And who are these Trump supporters?
You know, it's interesting, and I know the typical answer would be is I don't know any of them. But the reality is we've been seeing that happening actually in a growing way on the Republican side, really beginning in about 2010. There has been kind of a growing, whether you call it the Tea Party or an anti-establishment sentiment, a growing sense of frustration that political leaders, frankly, on both sides of the aisle, are not listening to the concerns or addressing the concerns of everyday Americans.
But you couldn't put a description around who is a Trump supporter, a typical...
You know, I think that a number of political scientists have tried to identify it. He certainly isn't a conservative in the traditional sense. He certainly isn't even a Republican in the traditional sense. But he is certainly a strongman, authoritarian figure. And that's the kind of bluster and anger that people are resonating with. And in some ways, I think voters are confusing his vulgarity and his crassness for a lack of political correctness. But they're not the same thing.
Now, you had told me that Colorado politics kind of mirrored this 6 years ago. So in the 2010 gubernatorial race, we have history with this. In the Republican primary for that race, you can see Dan Mays there won 51% to 49% over Scott McGinnis. Now, I have to say some of that was because of a Denver 7 investigates a plagiarism scandal with Scott McGinnis that impacted that result. But then in the actual election, Dan Mays, who got 51% in the primary, only got 11% in the general election and got wiped out there by Governor John Hickenlooper. Are you comparing then Mays to Trump to Mays?
I think that there are some potential historical parallels. What fueled a lot of Dan Mays' candidacy and the reason he secured the party's nomination narrowly in 2010 was because you had a segment of angry voters. They were mad at the current establishment. They didn't want to vote for anybody who had political experience as they saw it. And so you had a segment of the voters voting largely against Scott McGinnis and not necessarily for Dan Mays. But then when it came time for the general election, hundreds of thousands of Republican voters looked at the candidate who was the Republican Party nominee and said, this is a guy who isn't really qualified to be our governor. We're going to vote for another candidate, either for the Democrat or for a third party as a protest vote. And I fear that the Republican Party may be going down this same road, where they're voting angry in the primary, but then by the time the general election comes around, they'll say, is this the person that we really want to become the next leader of the free world and the President of the United States?
Yeah. Let's bring in Steve Welchert. We don't want to ignore the Democrats, but Democrats have to be loving all of this division, I guess, for lack of a better word.
Well, it's certainly fun theater to watch, and there's no doubt about that. I think Republicans may look back on Thursday past and say that was the day their entire party came off the rails. I mean, it started in the morning with the conversation about Mitt Romney, and then Donald Trump talking about comparing Mitt Romney having to get down on his knees. That was not sexual innuendo. People got that really clearly. And then later on in the evening at the debate, I mean, goodness, we're talking about hand sizes and male sexual parts. Yeah. That's vulgar, and it's really beyond the pale. I don't know where the starting point is now for Republicans to kind of move off of that. And if that's the Republican brand, it's going to be a tough fall.
I guess the closest thing to a Democratic controversy, we took a phone call in the newsroom, multiple phone calls about Colorado's caucus system. Hey, Bernie Sanders got the majority of the votes, but in the end, the delegates may be even out. How does this work?
Right.
I mean, that seems to be a problem with the people who don't know the inner workings of the system.
Yeah, the rules in both parties are kind of archaic, and they are for insiders, no doubt about it. I think the delegates that get selected at the convention will clearly be Bernie Sanders supporters. But there are superdelegates, members of Congress, governor, those kind of people, and they've already pledged to Hillary Clinton, and that's how it's going to break out.
Where do you see Bernie Sanders' role in this race now? I mean, clearly Hillary Clinton is on a path.
Right. Well, my personal view is that Bernie Sanders has done a phenomenal job. He's energized the party. He's brought new people to the party. At my caucus, we had 75 people in my single precinct, a good half of whom I've never seen before. And Orion's had similar experiences. And so getting new energy, new people, a lot of young people in was important. And he's also forcing Hillary Clinton to kind of get her sea legs a little bit, become a better candidate, understand what's going on. But this dynamic on the Republican side is incredible. And Republicans are in a tough spot. I mean, they're kind of playing let's make a deal. Behind door number 1 is Donald Trump. That's a slippery slope to the White House. Behind door number 2 is kind of Mitt Romney and John McCain and the dump Trump crowd. And I'm not sure that's an alternative you want to follow. And alternative number 3, door number 3 is going to be Donald Trump playing the role of Tom Tancredo, being a third-party candidate. If you dump him at the convention with a rules gimmick, he'll come out of this thing as a third-party candidate, and then you're really in a tough spot.
Yeah. It's going to be a real challenge. The Republican Party, I believe, has always been committed to following the rules. And if Donald Trump comes into that convention with the majority of the delegates that have been secured as a result of these contests, the Republican Party really has to follow those rules, and he will become the Republican Party nominee.
But you acknowledge there'll be some rules fights on the floor, maybe some credentials fights on the floor.
Credentials, rules, insider stuff. But I think in some ways folks will kind of resign themselves to the fact that that's the case. And then you will see Republican elected officials, candidates running for local office, doing everything they can to distance themselves from someone who doesn't reflect their values, who doesn't respect and reflect the party's historic brand. It may be a cathartic moment for the party where they sort of work all of the anger and frustration out, and then you can point to the results of the election to say, this is what happens when you vote angry. But the challenge, of course, is that the Democratic Party hasn't given the American people much of a credible alternative. Someone who may be facing federal indictment is the Democratic alternative. And it puts the American people to a hard choice when both parties aren't doing their job of putting credible candidates forward.
What does it say when you still don't have anything figured out that we know today ahead of the convention, which I love because I want to see a brokered convention? But where's the difference between this is entertaining and, man, we don't have our stuff together?
I think in part that is exactly the reason why Mitt Romney earlier this week stepped forward to try to be the adult in the room, to try to offer, hey, everybody, let's behave like adults and realize that voting with our middle finger is not going to lead America or the Republican Party or any of the values that we care deeply about further along. It's actually going to lead to a result that no one is going to be happy with.
Was he the right messenger for that particular speech?
He is clearly an imperfect messenger, but who else can the Republican Party step forward? And Paul Ryan's the Speaker of the House. He has to maintain a degree of neutrality. The chairman of the Republican National Committee can't do it because he has to oversee a process that needs to play itself out. There are very few voices that can offer that kind of thoughtfulness and command the attention that Mitt Romney did. I'm grateful for what he did. I think his words and his plea to Republican voters around the country, I hope, will be heeded. But if not, at least he'll be able to lay out a marker to say, this is not conservatism, this is not republicanism. And if the voters decide to go down that road, they'll at least be able to, I hope, look back to say, look, there was another path that was offered. Maybe we can learn from this.
So the hate mail should go to Ryan Call, not to Channel 7 News, right?
But when you watch these debates, I mean, there are record numbers of people watching these debates. So clearly, at some point, viewers like the name calling and finger pointing and the...
Well, look, the challenge is I think the American people have been desensitized to the idea that this is just reality television. And at the end of the day, they'll change the channel and everything will be fine. I think that some people aren't necessarily really understanding the result of their decisions, or maybe they're hopeful that the Republican establishment at the end of the day will save them from themselves.
House of Cards is back on Netflix starting Friday night, and it's going to be boring by comparison to what we're seeing now. That's really the irony of all this.
But why is it considered unthoughtful that you're not doing something smart with your vote if you support Trump? I'm hearing like, we have to get you away from that. This is how it works. This is how elections work. Why are we insulting those voters that support Trump by saying you're not smart enough to make this decision? I
think that in many ways that was exactly part of Romney's plea. He's begging them to be smart about their decision, to be thoughtful, to encourage and empower voters to realize that the choices that they make will determine the kind of future that they have.
But why aren't they? Well, they are. They're making that decision.
Voters are angry. I think voters are frustrated with the political gridlock that they perceive. They're frustrated by a lot of right-wing talk radio steering, dealing people up. They're also frustrated with what they're seeing in their own communities and maybe with the direction of America. And they're feeling powerless. And so it is, the political scientists will tell you that it is natural to look towards a strong authoritarian type figure when you're feeling insecure.
Let's be just a nudge more honest about this discussion. You guys invited Donald Trump to the party, and so now he's turning the thing inside out on you. I mean, Mitt Romney said clearly, if he'd have said these things about the KKK and stuff 4 years ago, I wouldn't have sought out his endorsement. The truth is, Donald Trump was a serious birther 4 years ago. He said Obama was born in Kenya, he was a Muslim, all that stuff, and yet that was good enough for an endorsement back then. When you allow that kind of thing to seep into the public dynamic, you're going to get some response like this, I think.
We will be debating this for weeks still, because it still won't be decided by the time maybe summer rolls around. Who knows?
It's a great conversation. Thank you
Sure
both for being with us.
you.
And we will continue this, of course. And I guess the bottom line is people are interested in politics. So it's an exciting time to be involved.